Okay, before we begin our Sumi-e painting, I thought we could go outside the traditional way of doing it and make a more interesting background that we can paint our simplistic designs on. So what I thought we would do is use a little bit of the reduce, reuse, recycle and the materials that I've been saving. I have collected dry old markers and extracted the cartridge inside and then soaked those cartridges in water. And now we can use that ink as an ink wash. So that's what we'll do today. We're going to put an ink wash on a piece of white paper, play around with different techniques and ways that we can create a textured background, and then we will paint on top of those. So let's get started, and I will walk you through 4 different techniques to create an interesting background for your Sumi-e paintings. The techniques that I'm going to show you are things that you can use when you have a wet medium like watercolor or ink washes. So the first technique I'm going to show you is called wet paper. So it's just that. You wet your paper first and then you take the ink and dab it in certain areas, allowing the ink to spread, and use the wet paper as a vehicle to spread the ink across the surface. So let me show you how that's done. Simply use water to wet your entire piece of paper. Now I'm going to repeat this a couple times, so make sure that you listen the first and second and maybe third time. When you are using wash or water on this paper, which isn't very absorbent, you need to only go over it 1 or 2 times. Do not keep going over and over and over the same spot, as it will break the surface of the paper and it will ruin. Could potentially get a hole in it. So just try to quickly go over it 1 or 2 times and then stop. So now that the surface is covered with a wash of water, take your ink and begin to dab the ink in different places. As you can see, the ink is bleeding into different areas, creating a variety of just natural organic patterns. I think that it usually sometimes will look like a marbled pattern. Great to give the illusion of mountains, rocks, ground surfaces, but it can be the pattern and it can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. And no 2 surfaces will be the same, as it's very random in the way that it bleeds. Right, so this is what you would do if you choose to do your background surface with the wet paper and then the wash on top. This next technique uses salt. So I call this the salt wash, or wash salt. For this, you will begin by putting the ink on your paper. Again, I want to remind you, don't go over the same spot over and over again. Use your arm and long sweeping brush strokes to cover the surface quickly and efficiently, not going over the same spot over and over again, as it will break the surface of your paper and it will put a hole in it and you will cry, as well as me. So don't do it. Heed my warning, folks. Good, that took me less than 30 seconds to do. Right. Then I'm going to take coarse salt granules and sprinkle them on top of my paper. What happens is when the salt dries, it will pull from the moisture around each salt crystal, soaking up the color as well. So you don't need a ton, just a light sprinkle. Don't go crazy, just a light sprinkle, a pinch of salt. Then that will dry, and as it dries again, each salt crystal will soak up the ink around it, leaving these almost flower-like speckled patterns. This might be good if you're thinking about doing a cherry blossom branch or some sort of pond seam with fish on top, as it gives the texture of water or blossoms. The next technique uses Saran Wrap on an ink wash or a watercolor wash to pull different sections and push the ink in areas to make lights and darks. As you can see, it almost has a mountainous, cracked ice feel and is a really great, interesting background that creates more angles and geometric forms. So, like the salt wash, I'm going to cover my paper with the wash. So to save time, let's speed things up a bit, shall we? For this technique, take a large sheet of Saran Wrap, maybe the length of the paper, and try your best to lay it on the paper, and then begin to scrunch and pull the areas to the center. If you'd prefer to put the Saran Wrap in more of a mountain pattern, you can maybe use another piece to bunch the Saran Wrap in different ways. But this, as you can see, when it dries, it's going to dry with the darker lines and lighter areas as it's sucked up and pulled the ink into the folded areas of the Saran Wrap. So we actually leave the cellophane and Saran Wrap on the paint, on the paper, and then pull it off when it's dried. This last technique uses rubbing alcohol on the ink or watercolor wash. Notice how it's created puddles or resists where the rubbing alcohol went. So I'm going to show you how to do that one. It's quite easy. Again, I'm going to speed things up a bit as you know now what to do for putting the wash on your paper. So let's speed it up. So using the eyedropper and some of the rubbing alcohol, you simply drop the rubbing alcohol in different areas, and notice wherever the rubbing alcohol went, it's starting to push away the color, push away the water, creating a polka dot kind of speckled pattern. You can even maybe flick, controlled flicking, don't go crazy, but as I'm moving my wrist to have several drops come out at the same time, so it's a little more interesting than just circles. Right, folks, so be very careful when you bring your paper over to the drying rack. Try to hold it very taut and flat, like you're holding it as if a tray of drinks were on top of it, as soon as you start to tip it, all of the wash will slide. So make sure you carefully keep it nice and taut when you bring it over to the drying rack and let it set. Again, it's very, very wet, so don't tilt it, as all of those lovely patterns you created, all that salt will fall right off and you'll just be left with a blank piece of background for your Sumi A painting.